Oh, hello, and we're in John's Gospel. We've now moved on to chapter 4, where most of the chapter is concerned with Jesus meeting the woman at the well, a very well-known incident in Jesus' life. And what I'm going to do today is just look at the background to that. We're going to read the first 6 verses of chapter 4, and just focus on the background before we get into the real events which happened at that time. Jesus' encounter with the woman from Samaria. So let's read chapter 4, verses 1 to 6, reading from the ESV. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize anyone, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field. Apologies for that beep. It's a football up. Someone scored a goal. Hopefully it's Burnley. Called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from the journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. So, first of all, we see Jesus here is avoiding conflict with the Pharisees. The Pharisees they were a bit concerned about John the Baptist. I think when they'd gone to see John the Baptist, I think he'd called them a brood of vipers at some point. He called someone a brood of vipers anyway. And they're now seeing that Jesus has been even more successful than John. So they're getting concerned about it. So Jesus backs off. Now, sometimes Jesus sought conflict. I mean, a number of times on the Sabbath, and there were Pharisees there. Is he going to heal them? Is he going to heal someone? And he would call the person forward in front of all of them and heal the person. He would take them head on. And it's one or two places we'll see in John's Gospel where he gives an answer to a question there, which is going to make things worse in terms of antagonising the Pharisees. So Jesus is quite willing to have conflict, but he doesn't have conflict for its own sake. Here, it's not a time for conflict, so he just withdraws. Now, in this chapter, we're going to meet this woman from Samaria. Remember, we've just had the account of his meeting with Nicodemus. Now, Nicodemus was a rabbi, maybe he was a Pharisee, I can't remember now. He was well up in the Jewish hierarchy anyway. He ought to have known who Jesus was, but he didn't. His understanding was virtually zero. This woman, well, there's a number of things about her. She was a woman. The Jews didn't tend to have that high an opinion of women. She was from Samaria. We'll come on to that later. They thought scum of the earth was people from Samaria. We'll come on to why they thought that later. And she was living in sin. And yet she understood far more than Nicodemus did. You see, one of the keys to understanding the gospel, to really appreciating who Jesus is and what he's done for us, is an awareness of our own sin. And this woman she didn't have some highfalutin opinion of herself, unlike the Pharisees. So she could see Jesus for who he really was. And it talks about Jesus baptized. John the Baptist obviously baptized. Jesus baptized him. His disciples who actually did the baptizing itself. And baptism itself wasn't new. Converts to Judaism would go through a baptism of sorts. What was new was that the Jews were being baptized. And John the Baptist and apparently Jesus were saying, you need to be baptized to the Jews. Essentially, it's telling the Jews, you need to repent. And that's what they didn't like. That's what the Pharisees, if the Pharisees, the religious leaders, had accepted that they were sinners in need of forgiveness, their approach to Jesus would have been so different. Anyway, he's going off through Samaria. Now, why did the Jews have such a low opinion of the Samaritans? Well, it went back over 700 years. After Solomon, the kingdom split into the northern kingdom, which is called Israel or Ephraim, various both names at various stages, and Judah. And Ephraim or Israel, the northern kingdom, was the worst. Now, that Judah quickly caught up in terms of sinning and rebelling against God, but the Samaritan part led the way in rebelling against God. And they were conquered, lots of goals being scored. They were conquered by the Assyrians in about 722, 721 BC. And when the Assyrians conquered the land, they did two things. They deported many of the people, generally the higher echelons in society, in Samaria, and they settled in Samaria many foreign people. So the race was mixed, and that's why the Jews, who considered themselves to be pure, didn't think very highly at all of the Samaritans. Now, Jesus, of course, had a very different view, as we see here, meeting the woman from Samaria, as from the well-known parable, where you've got these couple of religious figures and do nothing to help a man who's been robbed and beaten up, whereas a Samaritan does all that he can to help this person. So Jesus had a very different opinion, but the Jews generally didn't. And we see actually that Samaria, although the Jews had a low opinion, it had many roots in Israel's history, as it talks about there Jacob's well and the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And they were still part of God's plan, as indeed the whole world is part of God's plan. And then finally, what can we say? Well, Jesus was there. It says he was wearied from the journey. Jesus is God, was God, still is, always has been, always will be. He is God. He's also human. Fully human. Not pretending to be human. He was fully human. That's why he was weary. So he sits down by the well. It says it was the 6th hour. That meant it would be midday. And as we know, mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. So most people would not go out to get water at midday because it was too hot. Only people who didn't really want to meet anyone else, like this Samaritan woman, who we'll start to encounter in the next talk or two. But anyway, that's the background to what's going on in this incident.